Hello, my name is Samuel Reynolds, and I'd like to share a short video with you on harmonics. So I learned from my students recently that there's not a lot written on the web or videos shared on the web that deals with the topic of harmonics. So harmonics, uh, put simply, and you may already be familiar with this from your own studies in astrology, is basically the relationship between planets, also called aspects, but harmonics is more specific. So even though you may not know as much about astrology, you don't need to know a whole lot. You do need to know a little more than just that you're a particular sun sign, like, hey, Scorpio or Sagittarius. So ideally, you would have had your chart done or had some look at a chart, but you don't have to. So this video is focused on giving you an introduction on planetary relationships under the rubric of something we call harmonics. So let me share with you what I have. Um, I'll turn off my video and focus on sharing my screen with you. And we'll take it from there. I'd like to also annotate with you. And then I'm going to go to full screen so that you can see everything. So we're going to talk about what is your frequency, the nitty-gritty intro into harmonics, which is my particular brand in terms of talking about astrology, dealing with nitty-gritty, getting into like the details and figuring that out from there. So when we talk about the idea of, oops, went too fast. When we talk about the idea of harmonics, we're talking about the various interplay relationships that add up to form a numerically ordered pattern that has a unique meaning. In other words, when we say that particular planets have a relationship, they either a relationship that is more of the first harmonic, second harmonic, third harmonic. And so as an example, the first harmonic would be what we call in terms of aspects that are by conjunction, meaning they are right next to each other or on top of each other. Second harmonic, meaning that they're on the other side of the chart, or we could say the other side of the celestial room from each other. So that's more second harmonic. Third harmonic would be a trine. So they form a triangle in the sky. So that's supposed to be, again, the third harmonic. So when we talk about the harmonics, we look at that in relation to a set number, first, second, third. And we focus in on specifically what we call the prime numbers. And the prime numbers, again, are numbers, you might remember this from your elementary school days, are the numbers that can only be divisible by themselves. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, these are all prime numbers because you can't get to those particular numbers by any other way in terms of multiplication or division, except by the number itself. So 7 times 1 is the only way by which you normally will get to 7. Now, more compound numbers, or the other numbers in which we can arrive a different way, like 2 times 2 equals 4. So we have the fourth harmonic, would be like the square, in which planets have what we call a 90-degree relationship to each other. Or when they're a sextile, they have a 60-degree relationship to each other. Now, what's significant about those particular numbers is that the baseline idea for those harmonics we can already glean from looking at 2. So really, the compound harmonic of 4 is how we get to it from 2 times 2. So it's doubly an opposition. So it's kind of dealing, or it's half, you could say, of the opposition, but doubly the experience of the opposition. It's more of an inner dynamic and tension that you feel rather than external tension. Similarly, you could say for the sextile, it's the result of 3 times 2. So it's the idea of the third harmonic, the trine, in relation to the second harmonic, the opposition. So there's a way in which we experience harmony, or we experience a flow of the trine, but we have still some measure of a little tension, or the tension has become a little more muted. That's why the sextile is often described as the way by which we can experience opportunity. It's not as easygoing as the trine, but it's not as rough going as the square or the opposition. We can create various harmonic charts based on the baseline chart, which we call the natal chart. You can arrange or rearrange your natal chart into various harmonics for free at astral.com, or you can do it by hand using a method that Bob Marks illustrates on his website, and it's given here, but it's bobmarksastrologer.com/harmonics 32.1.html. So this particular presentation will be available as a PDF. So you can download it from my website at Unlock Astrology, and I'll give that information at the end, but unlockastrology.com, you'll be able to access this if you don't feel like writing down the particular website for Bob Marks. But what's important to know here, because we can get really technical in terms of talking about harmonics, but we don't have to go there. The important thing to know is that a harmonic chart matches up planets and points like your midheaven or your ascendant or your Jupiter or your Saturn or your sun, and how these particular relationships and the ways in which they connect resonate at particular what we could call frequencies or harmonics. So for instance, planets separated by squares in your chart will come together as a conjunction at your fourth harmonic, or planets that are trine in your chart forming a triangle become conjunctions if we use the third harmonic chart. So what does that look like and what does it mean? There's a couple of different ways in which we can approach the idea of harmonics rather than just talking about the numbers. So I thought it might be helpful to look at the various harmonics. I have a listing of what they mean, and I will go over particularly the 11th harmonic. We're going to focus in on that, and I'll get into a little bit why. But for each of the harmonics, and you'll see that all the prime numbers, the first 31 prime numbers, are listed there. Now, the numbers that are missing are not prime numbers. So that's why they're not listed. But another way you might think about harmonics is how we're divvying up the circle. So when we're talking about the whole circle, a whole 360 degrees, then we're looking really at the first harmonic. When we're kind of dividing up the circle by half, then we're talking more about the second harmonic, and so on. The third harmonic is by thirds, the fifth harmonic is by fifths, the seventh harmonic is by sevenths, and so on. Now, when we're talking about the relationships between planets, that's when we get into a matter of degree. And it may seem like, well, Sam, I thought we were talking about fractions. We could talk about fractions, but that can get complicated when you always have to remember, well, a fifth equals 72 degrees of a circle. So that's why I list the particular degrees. So when planets are, say, 72 degrees from each other, they are participating in a fifth harmonic dynamic. Similarly, if planets have a 51 degree and 26 minute relationship, as we see here, they're participating in the seventh harmonic. If we go by planets having a relationship that are 32 degrees and 44 minutes, then we can say they're participating in an 11th harmonic, and so forth. So these are the ways by which we can understand these fractions, by which we can understand these harmonics. And again, the harmonics, and even by meaning, give us a sense of what's happening between these planets. And if we have enough planets that have that kind of relationship, then we can see a preponderance, a surplus of particular harmonics that have a particular meaning. So going to my illustration, the 11th harmonic means that self-knowledge, meaning where there's an active interrogation of self, or where there's a lot of discussion or focus on self, and maybe even some awareness, it leads to a dogged persistence and a defiant spirit to show the world what that self is made of. This is like, someone who knows themselves and is going to let the world know who they are, come hell or high water. So one person that illustrates this very powerfully is Donald Trump. So I know he's been in the news a lot lately, so I do want to say that one of the reasons why I'm selecting him, because yes, he has been newly inaugurated as the President of the United States. But one thing that also stands out about President Trump is that he has a strong preponderance of planets in the 11th harmonic. And I'm using software to be able to arrive at this. And specifically, I'm using Sirius software named after the star, not so much the quality of being Sirius, although it is very strong and powerful Sirius software. But this is from Cosmic Patterns, which is owned and operated by David and Faye Cochran. And I'm going to talk a little more about David toward the end. But with this particular software, one can see pretty readily that Donald, and this is just half of his planets, has a strong preponderance of planets and connections between the planets in what we call the 11th harmonic. And remember what I said about the 11th harmonic. When we talk about the 11th harmonic, to go back, we're talking about self-knowledge that leads to a dogged persistence and defiance to show the world that self. And here we have the strong 11th harmonic. But there's another way we could have seen that. Now, again, before I go there, I just want you to remember as an example that the 11th harmonic registers at 1/11th of a circle. And so if you divided a circle by 360 by 11, you would come up with this number, 32 degrees and 44 minutes if you transposed it into degrees. You would get a more decimal system that you would have to convert, but that's what you would ultimately get with. Now, when we look at Donald's chart, and again, this is for Donald Trump's chart, as you see here, June 14th, 1946, 10:54 a.m., Queens, New York, we can get a breakdown of his various planets in what we call the aspectarian here, and this is what this is called. And we can see the various relationships. Now, many of these particular relationships you can see very cleanly and clearly in the chart itself. Like I can see his opposition between his moon and his sun. He's almost a full moon baby. We can see the opposition between his moon and his Uranus. And we can see the opposition between the moon and the north node, which is also conjoined to the south node. Now, the 11th harmonic is kind of hard to see. And remember, that's 32 degrees and 44 minutes. So what we would be looking for in terms of figuring out, does Donald have a high 11th harmonic, is where we would see instances where either he has strong connections between two planets that actually directly relate to 32 degrees and 44 minutes, like we see between his Venus and his sun, or if he has measurements between planets that's half of that, which is the 22nd harmonic. Let's pause for a second. It's the 22nd harmonic. Well, that actually is a compound, right, of 11 times 2. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we go up a harmonic, we usually go down by half of that. So for instance, the 8th harmonic is 45 degrees. But you might remember I said the 4th harmonic was 90 degrees. So it's the same principle. If we say 32 degrees and 44 minutes, then we're talking roughly about 16 degrees and 22 minutes. And I know this is getting very technical, so you don't necessarily have to rely on all the technicality, but if you want to know a little more about aspects, this can be helpful. And you want to know a little more about harmonics. But here's the thing to know. We have Venus and Sun, and then another example of that, that's 16, 22, and pretty close. We have the Mercury and his Venus also showing at the powerful 11th harmonic. And we can continue on where we're looking for anything close to 30, 32. We have again here with Mars and Saturn. We look at this row. We don't have as much. We go to this row. We also don't have as much or anything. But we do have something here between the Mercury and Pluto, which is close to that 32 degrees, within a degree of it. And then we can go over here to this next row, and we see it again with Saturn and his north node at 33 degrees and 4 minutes. And then we can go on down to this next row, and then this next row, And again, we could have been looking for 16, which we were. We also were looking for 32. And that's pretty much what we have. And so now that may not have sounded like a high number of planets in the 11th harmonic or in relationship to each other at the 11th harmonic, but that's more than usual. And so that actually does lead to wanting to look at his 11th harmonic. And you might remember I said that he had it between his sun and his Venus, and look, they're right next to each other. And when we go to the 22nd harmonic, when they're opposite to each other, you might remember I said that there was something about his sun and his Jupiter. And I can go back for that just briefly here to look, sun. And we have the Jupiter. Now, again, it's at 114 degrees and 31, but that's a higher octave of it. That's nearly 120 degrees. So if we were to count 32 degrees a couple of times, we would come near to that number. But we also see here that he has Sun Venus, he has the Sun Jupiter opposition, and this again, just to be clear, is looking at his chart at the 11th harmonic. And then you also see here, we also see here that he has a Mars-Saturn conjunction. And this is different from his chart. And notice I'm not talking about the signs at all. They're not important because it's not so much about going into different signs as much as different relationships between the planets themselves. And so even the Saturn moon, which again is here, we can go to the moon and we can go to Saturn here. That's 30 degrees. That's 2 degrees shy. I must have missed that one. That's 2 degrees shy of the 11th harmonic that we talked about at 32 degrees and 44 minutes. And you can see here that we have a Saturn moon opposition, and you see that's about 2 degrees difference. And again, it's not so much about the sign, but that dogged persistence that really is like the focal point of his chart. And you can see it creates like these strong oppositions between the 11th harmonic and the 22nd harmonic, both here with the Sun and Venus, and then Jupiter somewhat to his Mercury. And then we have the moon and Pluto together, opposite to Saturn and Mars. And then with the North Node also in the mix and the South Node in the mix, it forms a bow tie. That means that when we talk about the 11th harmonic, we are talking about this dogged persistence, this defiance to show the self no matter what. And with that great degree of that energy, we can see that this is someone who uses some aspects of awareness of himself, or the constant interrogation of himself, or you could say the fascination with himself, however you might want to look at it, in order to kind of get to the point of wanting to experience and express that self no matter what. One other powerful example of someone who also had this harmonic is Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire, the dancer, also had this diligence and this amazing work ethic, this dogged persistence to get where he had to go, not just as a dancer, but even as somewhat of a perfectionist. And this is also noted about Mr. Trump in terms of his ability on, not his ability, but his insistence on a certain level of perfection. You know, he is an admitted germaphobe. He is very concerned about certain aspects of order and how things appear. And one thing to say that I can say in this, amidst all the negative things that's said about him, and one can say, but one thing I will say is that when he entered the race in June of 2015, no one took him seriously. No one thought he would be able to go the course in order to become president of the United States. And despite almost every forecast, from astrologers to other kind of pundits, he became the president of the United States. And I do believe that one thing that contributes or signifies that particular power is looking at his 11th harmonic chart. So what I just want to say is that it's good to know your harmonics, and you can see where you have a particular strong harmonic in your chart. So for instance, I know that I'm strong in the 5th harmonic. So creative thought to heat up what I say a cold reality, sometimes leading more from the head rather than from the heart. But the creative thought the generative power of coming up with ideas is something that highly favors a person who has what we call a lot of quintiles, or also known as the fifth harmonic. This is another name for the 72-degree aspect, the quintile. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I do recommend that you go to David Cochran's YouTube and check out his particular videos. And you can look under harmonics and vibrational astrology. Two books I would recommend are Spirit of Numbers and Harmonic Charts by David Hamblin. I have read and even reviewed for the Mountain Astrologer, The Spirit of Numbers, and I think it's an excellent book. And then, of course, the granddaddy of harmonic charts as we understand them in the modern era comes from John Addy. His books are not readily available unless you're you happen to come across them in an old or used bookstore. But you can get them, or at least one of his books, on Amazon in an anthology called Harmonic Anthology, edited by Chris Brandt Riskey, published by the American Federation of Astrologers. Again, this will be available as a PDF, and if you want to kind of get more information about that, and see it and review it for yourself. And I just like to thank you for checking this video out, and have a great day.